to welcome you to the School Governing Body Elections Procedures that's being hosted by KZN Natosa. It is just after 2:30, and we did say we would start at 2:30 sharp. We don't have nearly the number of people that registered, but I'm going to start while we wait for the rest to join us. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Leanne Roos. I'm one of the executive officers here in the KZN office. I know we've got people from all around the country that are joining us today, so I'd like to say a special warm welcome to all of you that are from outside of KZN, a very warm KZN at the moment, if I may add that. And then a special welcome to a panelist that I have with me today, Dr. Arno de Lange. Dr. de Lange is the Provincial Chief Executive Officer of the Governing Foundation, the Governing Body Foundation here in KwaZulu-Natal. This lady is a lady that has many years of experience in education as a principal, and then subsequent that to the with the Governing Body Foundation. And this is a lady that knows her policies, her South African Schools Act, I think backwards and inside out, and any other way you can think of her knowing it. And Dr. de Lange has been invited to join us today so that as we go along with this presentation, if there are any questions that you would like to ask, you can place in the chat or in the Q&A, and she's going to assist us in answering some of the technical questions that may arise today. I would just like to share with you that the presentation is going to focus more on the procedure in terms of electing the members to the governing body. The actual, what happens after the elections and the roles and responsibilities, and that will come at a later stage in a workshop once the period of governing body elections is over. You will know that the Minister of Education extended the election period from 1 March 2021 to 30 April 2021 because of the current pandemic and the uncertainty we find ourselves in as we started the year. So we're not just limited to the 1 year, the 1 month of the governing body elections. It's now going to be spread over 2 months. We then also have in KZN specifically a provincial gazette that was sent out that everyone worked on. Myself and Dr. de Lange were part of the task team that developed that policy, which is also in line with the national policy and adds a bit to the national policy. We're going to go ahead and start with the presentation. The policy and the new gazette has made allowance for e-elections or e-voting to take place, as well as for COVID-19 protocols that has to be put into place. You'll know that if you are part of the governing body and elected to the governing body, you will serve a term of office of 3 years, except for RCL, who serve a 1-year term of office, and office bearers who are elected only serve a 1-year term of office. So the office bearers are re-elected every year into the governing body. We're just going to look at some of the definitions. We're not going to look at all the definitions available, but these are the ones that we're getting the most queries of, and the principals are struggling with the most or querying about the most. What is the definition of a parent in the policy? So therefore, when we say you're electing the parent component, who qualifies as a parent? Now, that would be a biological or adoptive parent or a legal guardian of the learner and we'll go into that in more depth later on in the slide. The person who is legally entitled to custody of a learner, and the last part of it is a person who undertakes to fulfill the obligations of a person referred to in paragraph A and B. So essentially, if a person undertakes to fulfill the obligations of a biological, adoptive, legal parent, or a parent that's legally entitled to custody of learner, they are considered parents and would then be eligible to be elected to the parent component, except if there's certain criteria that don't meet. An educator is the person who trains, educates, or teaches other people, provides educational services at the public school, including professional therapy and educational psychological services. So all your therapists at schools and psychologists at schools are also considered educators. However, your teacher assistants, teacher aides, or person appointed exclusively to perform extracurricular duties, for example, your head of sport. I know there was a question I received this morning. Your head of sport does not qualify as an educator, but they would qualify under the definition of member of staff. Now, member of staff is a person appointed according to the Public Service Act or the South African Schools Act, so that would be by the SGB, and is not an educator at the school, and includes the employee of a service provider or any persons appointed in terms of state-approved process who's based at the school for a period of not less than 12 months. The reason why we in KZN added that to the definition was because we know we've got the EEI initiative, which has appointed EEIs and teacher aides and all the rest to the school. And they would be eligible if they are appointed for a period of 12 months or more. Then just to look at the composition, how many people are elected to a governing body? Now there are two separate composition tables. The first would be for public ordinary schools and the second for special schools. Now, when we're looking at the policy as a whole, the majority of the policy for public ordinary schools and the elections in special schools is the same. There are a few differences here and there, and they will be highlighted as we go through with the presentation. First of all, let's look at the public ordinary schools. The number that is elected to or eligible for a SGB depends on the size of the school, whether you are a primary or a secondary school, or whether you are a combined school. You'll see on the table the number of learners enrolled also plays a role in terms of determining how many are on the SGB. First of all, the principal, purely in his capacity as a principal, is automatically a member of the SGB. The number of educators varies from 1 to 3, depending on your learner enrollment and the type of school you are. Your learner members, now remember, that is only applicable in the high school situation where you have RCLs from grade 8 through to matric. So primary schools, there are no learner members because we do not have RCLs in the primary schools. Staff members of staff in all situations is 1, regardless of the type of school or the number of enrollments. The number of parents varies from 4 to 9, and then the total varies from 7 to 17. So you need to have a look at your type of school and your learner enrollment to decide how many educator members need to be elected to your SGB and the number of members of staff, your non-educator staff, because that is what you primarily as educators and principals will be interested in. It's just good to know the number of parents to have that knowledge. In the special school, we have primary, secondary, and combined. And once again, it varies according to the learner enrollment and the type of special school. So primary, once again, your principal, or no, primary, secondary combined, your principal's automatically there. Your educators is 2 or 3, depending on the enrollment of learners. Your learner members, where possible, will be either 1 or 2, remembering only in secondary or combined, learners grade 8 or higher who are part of the RCL. Your non-educator members will also remain at 1, irrespective of whether it's a primary, combined, secondary, and the number of learners. And then your parent members also is 5 to 8, dependent on the size. And then there's an additional category for the special schools, which we'll look at later. And those are members who are appointed as per section 24, specifically of the KZN one. It's section 24, but these are the members of outside organizations that are there in terms of specialist knowledge that may be required on a school governing body in special schools. And the maximum number of members that can be appointed from the outside is a maximum of 5. So it does not have to be 5. It can be less, but it's no more than 5. So in special schools, the minimum number that we have is 14 going up to 20, dependent on your type of school and the number of learners that are enrolled at the school. Then the elected members, and this is where the voting comes in and the elections come in. And I know some schools have already started and ended that process, and schools are still in, many schools are still in the planning that process. You will have parent members, educators, your members of staff who are your non-educators, as well as your RCL learners from grade 8 or higher. Your principal is there because of the official capacity. And then you get co-opted members with or without voting rights in a public ordinary school. Now, a co-opted member is a member who is co-opted and decided upon by the governing body, who may be there to offer a specialized service or advice. For example, if security is a major need in your school and in your community that your school is set in, you may co-opt someone from the community policing forum or from police or security service that will be on the governing body to assist and make decisions and advise on security aspects, but they won't have voting rights. Those who are co-opted with voting rights are usually the ones that are co-opted when one of the members resigns. We know that you might have a grade 7 member elected to the governing body this year, and when the child leaves grade 7, they will no longer be able to be part of that governing body, and their seat will become vacant. And until the by-election takes place, then you will co-opt someone with voting rights until the by-elections take place. But that is also, the by-elections is something for another day and another training session. The public special schools, your appointed members are representative of sponsoring bodies or of organizations of parents of learners with special needs or organizations of disabled peoples. So those are your different categories that you can have in terms of your public special schools. And they're usually there with their specialist knowledge and advice to assist in making decisions and assist in the performing of the duties of the governing body. If we look at eligibility, so yes, you've got parents, we say parents, if they meet the definition of a parent. However, there are additional criteria for eligibility of a governing body. So although you may fit one of the definitions of those that may be elected, if one of these criteria excludes you, you then cannot be elected to the governing body. First of all, if you are mentally ill and have been declared as such by a competent court, if you are an unrehabilitated insolvent, and that is because, remember, part of the governing body duties is the finances and making decisions and having a FinCom. And you don't want someone who's an insolvent, who can't manage your finances as part of your governing body. A person who's been found guilty of an offence and sentenced to imprisonment by a court of law is for longer than 6 months. So if you've been sentenced to prison for longer than 6 months by a court of law, but if you were sentenced more than 3 years ago, so if your sentence expired 3 years ago, then at the time of your nomination, then you may be elected. But if you were spent 6 months in jail last year, if someone spent 6 months in jail last year, they're not eligible to be nominated and elected to the SGB. Those who've been declared unsuitable to work with children in terms of the Children's Act or the Sexual Offences Act, if the name appears in the National Child Protection Register, because remember, these governing body members are going to be on school property, have access to school property, and you don't want people who've got a history of abusing children or committing sexual offences against children being part of your governing body. If you no longer fall within the category that you elected to, so if you are a parent member and your child is no longer at the school, if you are elected as an educator and before your 3-year service term of office is up and you resign as an educator, you're no longer eligible to serve on the governing body. Then, if an educator has been found guilty of misconduct and has had a fine, a suspension, or a demotion, if they are appointed in terms of the Employment of Educators Act. Remember, it's your state-paid educators that are employed by in terms of the Employment of Educators Act. So if they've been found guilty of misconduct and have received a sanction, they cannot serve onto the governing body. And same with a member of staff who's appointed in terms of the Public Service Act. So that's your non-educator staff who are employed by the department. Once again, if they've been found guilty of misconduct and received a sanction, they are not eligible to be part of the school governing body. The head of department may have previously terminated your membership. And now that is something for a later training session where if there is misconduct on the SGB and various other things happening, if the head of department actually says you may no longer serve on the SGB and terminates your membership, you may not be eligible. And then this is one that we get asked regularly. If you are a parent who is employed at the school, whether you are employed at the school as an educator or you are employed at the school as a non-educator in an admin capacity, you may not serve on the school governing body as a parent member. If you are employed at the school, you are only eligible to be nominated as an educator rep or as a non-educator rep. And that is very, very important for you to know. It's one that we get asked regularly. Secondly, the other one we get asked regularly, if I'm employed by the SGB as an educator or non-educator, may I serve on the governing body? Yes, you may. As long as you are employed at the school, whether you're employed by the state or you're employed by the school governing body, you are eligible to serve either as an educator or a non-educator member of the governing body. When we're looking at the voters' roll, now this is the first piece of formality that becomes very important. For each type of elected person, there must be a voters' roll. So there's a voters' roll for parents, for the parent election, for the educators, for the members of staff, and for the learners from the RCL. The voters' roll must be prepared for parents in terms of the school admission register. So all the parents that are listed as parents or legal guardians of the learners that are in the school register will be placed on the voters roll. If they are not eligible to be on the voters roll, it is also their responsibility to inform the school that they're not eligible for nomination because of one of the categories. The same with educators. The list of all educators at the school must be available, and the same for the admin staff. And then your teacher in charge of the RCL will ensure that all the RCL's reps' names appears on a voters roll. So the voters roll is essentially a list of all those who are eligible to vote in the elections as well. Then, proof of parenthood. This is a query we've had a number of times in the office to say, this person's coming and claiming that they're the guardian of the child, so they want to be nominated for the SGB, but they're not the parent of the child. Now, there are various guidelines in place to assist the principal. Now, it's the principal's responsibility to prepare the note. Sorry, I've skipped one ahead. It's a principal's responsibility to determine who qualifies as a parent, who meets the definitions, and to obtain the proof and request the proof of parenthood. So the guidelines that must be taken into place, and each case gets dealt with on its own merit, is the reason for the person undertaking to fulfill the obligations. For example, you may have a case where the parent has gone and is working in the city, and the child is attending school at the local rural school where they live and is being looked after by a family member or someone who has been given the task of taking care of the child. They look at who the learner lives with. Where is the home situated of this person who says, I'm the parent, although I'm not the biological parent? What is the proximity of that home to the school? And then obligations must extend beyond financial obligations. Now that means you can't just say, I'm the legal guardian and I qualify as parenthood because I'm paying for the school fees. I actually have a query from a school at the moment who say they've got someone who's been on their school governing body for the last 20 years, because what he does is he identifies a learner that he will assume guardianship of, and he will then ensure that their education is looked after and paid for. And by doing that, he then is entitled to be on the school governing body. When we're looking at the parenthood, the obligations just not in terms of school fees. They look at the overall, are you taking care of the social welfare and all other aspects of the learner? So you're not just looking after them financially and paying their school fees. And unfortunately, there are guardians who say, well, I'm paying their school fees, so I'm entitled to be part of the SGB, even if the child's living with a parent. So we have a few technicalities that come in there where a principal's now got to decide, but does this person actually qualify to be on the school governing body? They look at your overall involvement and the responsibility of the person. So how involved is that person in the child's life? And that goes with the previous point of extending beyond financial obligations. If the learner has other siblings at the school, who's assuming guardianship or parenthood of the other siblings? Are the other siblings being looked after by biological parents when this learner is perhaps being looked after a legal guardian for some other reason? So that is another thing you look at. But the other siblings, who are they being looked after? The relationship of the person undertaking the obligations towards the learner. Is it a family member, for example? As I said, the one example that we've had, it's a person who once upon a time, 20 years ago, had children in the school and has got no real relationship with the learners. They've just said, you know, it will look after your educational needs and school fees to qualify for us to be on the SGB. It's a bit more complicated than that. The principal also needs to undertake reasonable investigation within the community to ascertain who the community regards as the parent. And I think this is more applicable into your real rural communities where you have children living with family members for various reasons, where the parents are working in the city and assuming jobs elsewhere and leaving the children with in the community. So the community even needs to help ascertain who they would regard as the parent. And then any other reasonable explanation. So if someone comes to you as a principal and says, I'm the parent or I'm the guardian, so I want to be nominated, you as a principal have the obligation to investigate and see whether they are in fact the legal guardians and to what extent are they taking ownership or parental rights of the children or the learner in question. When it comes down to legal custody and adoptive parents, and that there's usually legal paperwork and that in place, but in the absence of a legal document or a court document, these are the other factors that must also now be given due consideration. Then the notice of nomination and election meeting. Principals have to consider a convenient time and date for the voters when preparing the notices. So for example, a principal must take into consideration when preparing a notice for parents. Well, the majority of the parents in this school work till 4 o'clock or 5 o'clock. So it may not be possible or convenient to have the elections midday when they're all at work during the week. For the educators, preparing notices even for the educators, when is a convenient time for the educators? And in most cases, most schools use a break time or after school a meeting to do that. Same with the admin member of staff. And then also the RCL. Now I know that with the RCL and electing the RCL reps, it's been a bit more challenging this year because remember a number of schools are using the 50-50 or alternate day method of schooling. So I know a number of schools have had the challenge of saying, how are we going to ensure that all our RCL reps are at school on the same day? Because we're using alternate days or 50-50 attendance, etc., etc. So I know that has been a particular challenge for principals and deputy principals who are responsible for RCLs to try to find that convenient time to do that. All notices and forms, so those are nomination forms, must be sent to the parents at least 14 days prior to the election meeting. Okay, and when the notice goes out to parents, principals, you must also say they may come and inspect the voters' roll, because the voters' roll contains their information, and if the information is incorrect, they need to inform you, this information is incorrect, you need to update it. If there need to be amendments to the voters' roll, only the principal may authorize that. Then those who nominate or second the nominations or nominees must be listed on the voters' roll for their respective constituency. So this is the one technicality for educators and members of staff. Although you may not serve as a parent member, because you appear on the school admissions as a parent, you are actually allowed to nominate and vote in the parent meeting as well. So you may not be a parent component of the governing body. However, you may take part in the process for electing parent members to the governing body. And When it comes to educators, only educators on the voters roll will be allowed to nominate and second. Same with RCL members. So you can't have any learner saying, I want to nominate that person as our RCL rep for the governing school governing body. It can only be those RCL reps who are on the voters roll. If there are updates or any queries, it must be referred to the principal at least 7 days prior to the election date. So if you have any queries or on the voters roll, you see a name that maybe you think your name's maybe even missing from the voters roll, maybe it was admin error, you need to bring it to the attention of the principal 7 days prior to it. And then this is one aspect that not many are aware of. Your parent component is actually the last of the elected components that must be elected. So by the time you have the nomination and voting for the parent component, your educator, your member of staff, and your RCL component must already be elected. Your parents are the last to be elected. If you say, for example, have the educator election after the parent component, someone can actually say you've gone against policy and declare a dispute, and you may actually then be required to redo the procedure. So principals, when setting the dates and times for elections and sending out the notice of nominations and that, make sure your parent election meeting is the last to take place. All the others must be in place by the time the parent meeting takes place. The copy of the notice must be handed to the learners for the parents. So when the parent notice goes out, the principal must make sure it goes home with the parents, with the learners, sorry, and the learners must also actually specifically be instructed that the notice must be handed to the parents. The notice must, there must even be a notice for educators. So you can't just announce in a staff meeting, oh, by the way, we're having a staff election, educator election meeting on this date. It's got to be a written notice with the nomination forms. Same for your non-educator staff, and the same for the RCL. There's got to be a formal written copy of the notice. Besides giving it to each of the components, they must be displayed at school and where possible within the community, so that parents are made aware of it, because we also know learners don't always send or give the letters to their parents, and sometimes they're found crumpled up at the bottom of a bag a term or two later. I know a lot of schools are also using the D6 communicator to send out the notices and reminders and to display the notices. And the notices must be in the language of learning and teaching of the school, and where possible and where practical in the home language of the learners. So if the language of learning and teaching is English at the school, it will go out in English. If you find that the majority of the learners' home language is isiZulu, then if it's practical, then you may send out an additional notice in isiZulu as well to be taken home to the learners. And also, principals, part of sending out the notice and reminders is encouraging parents to participate. We know it's a challenge to get parents involved at schools and in the life of the school, and sadly in the life of the children. So regular reminders, notices, and I've seen a number of schools have been doing that via D6, saying, remember it's a meeting, we encourage you all to be there. Remember, parents, this is your chance to participate and assist in the governance of the school, and etc., etc. So it's really important that the principal makes that effort. And even for the educator, non-educator reps, sometimes you find educators saying, I don't want to be part of the SGB, it's extra meetings, it's extra responsibilities, I don't have time for it. So the encouraging of the people is important. Then when it comes to quorum, and this is applicable to all the elected members, regardless of what type of elected member, it's 15% of the voters on the voters' roll. So you have to ensure that when you start the election meeting, that you've already calculated, okay, these are the number of people on the voters' roll for parents, these are the number of people on the voters' roll for educators, non-educators, for RCL reps, and 15% is this number. So you need to know the minimum that are required to be at the election meeting. If you don't have that 15% quorum, you have to adjourn the meeting. You cannot continue with the meeting, and you have to reschedule the meeting. So you'd have to have a second meeting. That second meeting must be not less than 7 days from the original date, but not more than 14 days. And the reason why they're actually stipulating this in policy, what used to happen in the past, is schools used to send out notice and say, we're having our election meetings on the 11th of March, and if the quorum's not met, then we'll have our second meeting on the 12th of March. So there's now a 7-day period. You can't have it less than 7 days from that date. The nominations that were received prior to the meeting being adjourned will still be eligible at the second meeting, as well as any new nominations received. So if after the adjournment of the meeting, let's say it was supposed to take place on the 11th of March, and you didn't have quorum, so you've now reconvened for the 18th of March, you may still receive new nominations before that second meeting. So you can't say, well, you weren't nominated for the original date of the meeting, therefore you can't be nominated. You have to allow new nominations in that period from the meeting being adjourned due to lack of quorum to the new meeting being reconvened. And then just remember, you need to send out a notice for the second meeting. So all the normal applies. And in the notice for the second meeting, you must also specifically state that a quorum is not required. Because if you don't have your 15% quorum at the second meeting, it still goes ahead and the election takes place. Nominations, you've got the SEO, that is the school electoral officer. Now there's a whole process in terms of getting them appointed, which I'm not going to focus on because it doesn't affect you as an educator taking part in the elections. The school electoral officer will appoint in writing an assistant to act as secretary. Now this secretary will be the one that will be assisting with typing up of notices, assisting at the meeting, taking minutes of the meetings, etc., etc. If you are not eligible to vote, that person may not attend the meeting. So if there is the election meeting for an educator rep and a non-educator member wants to walk into that election meeting, they may not be there. The school electoral officer must say, you're not allowed to be here, and must ask them to please leave the meeting. When the voting takes place, no matter what category you fall under, you have to have a proof of ID, which would be your ID book, your ID card, a valid passport or proof of temporary residence or permanent residence if you are not a South African citizen. So that means your driver's license is not recognized as a proof of identification to vote at an election meeting. So if you're having the educator or the parent one, And it actually happened when I was teaching, and a parent came and they didn't bring their ID, they brought their driver's license. They were told by the school electoral officer, sorry, you can't produce an ID, your driver's license is not sufficient, you may not enter the room and attend this meeting. The school electoral officer during the nomination period, now that's a period in which the nominations are open for people to be nominated and the nominations to be received. The school electoral officer will communicate the time, how long are the nominations going to be open for, what period of time are they going to be there. They must inform the voters that nominations are going to take place from this time to this time. They must ensure there's sufficient time. They can't just say, we will give you 2 days to nominate. Because remember, people need to fill in forms, complete forms. The person that they're nominating must also agree to be nominated, must also sign and complete forms. So there's a process involved. So you're going to be reasonable in terms of giving them sufficient time. And when that time has expired, the school electoral office will say, the time has now expired, there will be no more nominations received. To be nominated in absence, the proposer and seconder must be present at the meeting and complete a nomination form, and the person nominated must confirm in writing. So let's say at the actual nomination and election meeting, a parent comes forward and says, I would like to nominate this parent, but this parent could not attend the meeting tonight. If the proposer and the seconder are both there, and they've already spoken to the nominated person, and that person has said in writing, I agree, I will allow myself to be nominated, then they can be nominated if they are absent. Same with an educator. Let's say at the meeting, an educator is ill and is called in sick for the day, and someone wants to nominate and second them. They would have had to communicate with that educator and ask the educator to send a letter, an email, a letter to say, we confirm that we accept our nomination and we prepare to be nominated in this process. The completed form must be received within 7 days, but not less than 24 hours prior to the commencement of the meeting. However, there may be verbal nominations, provided that the seconder and the nominated person has indicated that they're prepared to serve. And the nominated candidate must also be given an opportunity to be introduced to the meeting. So the school electoral officer will either ask the person that proposed them or nominate them to introduce the candidate, or the candidate themselves may stand up and introduce themselves and share with the meeting who they are, what their qualifications are, so that the meeting also know them. Remember, especially in your big schools, parents don't always know each other. They see names on a list, they see names of people who've been nominated, but they don't know what that person looks like or who they are. So they must be given an opportunity to introduce themselves so that the meeting knows who has been nominated and who they would want to vote for. If the total number of nominees whose nominations have been accepted is less than the number of members required. So let's say you require 5 parent members and you've only received 4 nominations. A new meeting will have to be convened with not less than 7 days, but not more than 14 days to get additional nominees. So if they say, but hang on, we don't have enough nominees to fulfill the vacancies available, then they've got to reconvene the meeting. That's the same if it's an educator rep. Maybe you're entitled to 3 educator reps and only one's been nominated at the election meeting. Then they've got to reconvene and allow a period for additional nominations to be made. If it's equal to the vacancies, so you're entitled to 5 parent reps and 5 nominees, nominations have been received, the school electoral officer will then declare every accepted nominee duly elected. Then you don't need to go into a voting process. However, if you receive more nominations and vacancies available, that is when the voting process comes into place. The names are written down on a board in the room or somewhere visible in the room, or maybe they're typed on a computer and the screen of that computer is being projected. But everyone sitting at that election meeting must be able to see who the list of nominees are. And then ballot papers must be prepared. Now, once again, some schools, what they do is they prepare ballot papers beforehand, if the principal has received the nominees beforehand, and leave a space available to write in any new nominations that may have been received subsequently. Or they have a ballot paper where they just say, okay, you will write down these 3 names for the 3 parent members that you would like to elect. The ballot paper must have the school stamp or any other distinguishing factor on it. And this is to prevent people coming in with their own pieces of paper and names and trying to bring in additional votes. Because remember, proxy votes aren't allowed. So a parent can't come in and say, I've got the proxy of this parent to vote for that parent. And that is also why ballot papers must have a distinguishing feature to prevent parents coming in and creating a ballot paper on behalf of another parent who couldn't be at the meeting. The school electoral officer will prepare the ballot paper. He will explain the voting process. So he will say, these are the number of people that you may vote for. We are eligible for 5 parents, therefore you may vote for 5 parents. You must use an X next to the parent's name to vote for them. Or you must use a tick, or you must write their name as it appears on the board or the screen in front of you. And he must explain this, because if it's not done according to the procedure, let's say they don't make an X, then it becomes a spoiled vote. Or they don't write it down the way they're supposed to, or the number of names. Let's say they're entitled to write down a maximum of 5 names and they've written down 6 names. So the full process must be explained in detail by the school electoral officer. And that happens at the parent meeting, election meeting, at the educator one, the RCL one, as well as the non-educator one. The school electoral officer is present at all election meetings and will explain the process. Also, it is a secret vote. So there shouldn't be no discussion between parents and saying, okay, this is I'm voting for, who you voting for, looking at each other's voting ballot papers, just like our normal IEC elections that we have, where we've got our little voting booths and we do it in secret and we fold up the ballot paper and we go put it in a closed box or container. That is actually how it gets done for the governing body elections as well. So if you're thinking of procedure, think of the IEC procedure. It's in secret. So no one is standing there looking over each other's shoulders, seeing who they vote for. The paper must be folded when they're finished voting, and it gets put into a box or a closed container. If there's a case where a voter is unable to make their vote on a ballot paper, maybe they're unable to write, maybe they're standing there with both arms broken, and are unable to write, they may request assistance from the school electoral officer, and the school electoral officer then puts a procedure in place for someone who is not able to make the mark on the piece of paper. If there's an erroneous spoiled ballot, now let's say you as an educator are voting for the educator rep. If you've made a mistake, let's say you've put a tick instead of a cross and you realize, oh no, I've made a mistake, I've put a tick instead of a cross. You have to go to the school electoral officer, tell them you've made a mistake on your ballot paper, and you'll be issued with a new one with the word duplicate. The one that you've made the error on will then be marked as spoiled, so that the people know this is the correct one, this is the spoiled one, this is the one that we're not going to use in counting. The spoiled votes are recorded on a template and they are retained with all the documentation. So the spoiled votes don't get thrown in the bin because they don't count. They are part of the documentation that needs to be kept on record relating to the elections. The votes must also be counted in presence of the 3 observers appointed by those attending the meeting. So educators, when you vote for your educator rep, you've got to appoint 3 observers from your educator rep that will observe the counting, and the school electoral officer and the person that they are assisted by will count it in their presence. So you've got observers to make sure that the counting is fair, that it's a transparent process, and that there's no one trying to rig the system or any allegations of rigging the system, as we sometimes have in our IEC elections. So ensure that you appoint observers and the votes will be counted in their presence. Just a note I forgot to mention earlier, the principal of the school is also an educator. So the principal of the school will also vote for an educator representative. That's a question we get quite a bit as well. May the principal vote for the educator rep? Yes, they are, because they're an educator. When you post level 1 to post level 4, you are an educator. If there's a tiebreaker between 2 candidates, there'll be a second vote that takes place between those 2 candidates. And it actually happened when I was teaching and we were electing an educator rep. We had 4 nominees and there was a tie for 2, and we had to redo the vote for those 2. And then after that, if there's still a tie, a coin toss decides, heads or tails, will decide which one then becomes a member of the school governing body. And that is for all elected categories. So not only for educator categories, but if you've got a tie between 2 parents, you redo the vote and there's still a tie, you toss a coin, you call heads or tails, and whichever you've called and land on, that is where that is a deciding factor. The results must be announced during the election meeting. So as soon as the parents are finished voting, the votes are counted at that same meeting and the results are announced at that same meeting. You can't say, oh, we need time to count, we'll call a meeting tomorrow and let you know the results. Remember, there's a possibility of a tie, and then a second vote needs to take place. So you can't say, oh, you all need to come back, there was a tie, we need to call you back. So the whole process happens at one meeting where you've got the nominations, the nominees introduce themselves, the process is explained, the voting takes place, the counting takes place, and the results are announced in that meeting. So the educators will sit and remain in the meeting until the votes are counted and the top 2 or top 3 or top 2 or top 1, depending on how many they qualify for. Same at the parents' meeting. Once the parents are finished voting, they do not leave the meeting. They return to the venue and wait until the votes are announced. In terms of, because it's secret one, what sometimes happens is they meet in a smaller venue where everything gets told and explained to them, and then they might move to the hall where the school sets up voting stations, where they've got almost like voting booths to go vote. But however, once they finish at the voting booth, they need to go back to the main meeting venue to await the results. Then the principal must submit the composition of the SGB within 21 days. So once they've all been elected, that goes to the district electoral officer, and that goes in writing to them. And that is for the special schools. And then for the special schools, 14 days before the elections, you must also send a written invite to the various organizations to attend a meeting to appoint a representative. So remember we said you allowed a maximum of 5 from outside organizations at a special school. You've got to send them a written invitation 14 days prior to that meeting, okay? The school electoral officer, regardless of whether you're a public ordinary school or a special school, chairs and conducts all the meetings related to the school governing body elections, from the nominations to the elections and then to the elections of the office bearers. Also remaining on special schools, the school electoral officer has the additional duty of directing organizations to identify their representatives. So the organizations must say, this is the person that we've appointed to serve on the governing body, with the name, address, contact details, etc., etc. Okay. More than one expert may be appointed depending on the needs of the school. As I said, you may have up to 5. Also, the nomination of these outside organizations for special schools, SGBs, must precede the parent meeting. So regardless of whether you're a public ordinary school or whether you're a special school, your parents are the last to be elected. Then if we look at the office bearers, now the election of the office bearers takes place after the full school governing body has been elected. Now in KZN, what often happens is at the meeting of the parents' elections, they actually have the non-educator and the educator representatives coming in towards the end of that meeting, because what they often do is they then say, because I announce the results on the same day, then the SGB convenes immediately after the parent election meeting to elect their office bearers. Now that is not a specific requirement. However, you've got to realize that, especially in terms of finance, we've actually got a school in this situation at the moment. Your FinCom authorizes certain payments and that. Now, once the parents have been elected and the people have been elected, your new governing body comes into being. Your previous governing body, it no longer has any rights. And if it happens like at a school that are sitting in the situation where their current finance representatives have not made themselves available to be appointed or elected back onto the school governing body, that school is now in a situation where they need to authorize and make payments on Monday. They are only electing the office bearers next week, Wednesday. So now they actually do not have the office bearers, the treasurer, and the right office bearers to actually authorize and make those payments that the school needs to make on Monday. So it's always important to get the election of the office bearers done as soon as possible after the parent meeting. Also, your school electoral officer also has to be present at this meeting. And sometimes the school electoral officers are appointed to govern the procedure for more than one school's governing body elections. So if you do it on the same day as the parent component, it's one less meeting for them to attend, and then it's easier and quicker to get a meeting scheduled than waiting for when he's available, because he's first got to go to that school's meeting and another school's meeting, etc., etc. Okay. The 14-day notice period must be issued that the office bearers will take place on the day of the parent election. So if you as a school want to elect the office bearers on the same day, you have to give that 14-day notice. So essentially, when you give the notice of the election meeting, you at the same time give the notice of the office bearer. The quorums of the first meeting requirements must be complied with. If you don't do it on the same day, the school electoral office officer must convene a school governing body meeting within 7 days of the parent election. So as soon as that happens, then there's an SGB meeting. So for convenience sake, I know lots of schools like to do it on the same day. Otherwise, within 7 days, it has to take place. And the school electoral officer must also make the governing body members aware of the responsibilities. So if you are chairman, this is what your responsibility is. This is what your responsibility is: deputy chair, treasurer, secretary of the governing body. And it's also a secret ballot. So it's not one of those where you sit and raise hands. It's a secret ballot. Remember, you've got those 4 office bearers that I've mentioned. Now, in a public ordinary school, only a parent member is eligible to be deputy chairperson or chairperson. Now, why I'm emphasizing its own for public ordinary schools, that same stipulation does not exist in the policy for special schools. So special schools does not limit a chairperson or deputy chairperson to a parent member only. It's only like that in a public ordinary school. It's a 1-year term of office. So every year you have to re-elect your office bearers, and every year your school electoral officer must come to that meeting and preside over that meeting. What happens in some schools, a member of staff is assigned in writing at the request of the SGB to designate a member of staff to assist the secretary or treasurer. So an admin officer often is assigned to assist the secretary in terms of getting minutes and notices and distributing those type of things, okay? The treasurer, often the bursar or the school's business manager, is assigned to or designated to assist the treasurer. But it must be a request from the SGB, and then it's done in writing and recorded in the minutes. The principal, once the office bearers have been elected, must submit all their details to the head of department within 14 days. But before submitting all their details, contact details, ID numbers, they have to receive the consent of the office bearers, because remember, we've got the Poppy Act. So the principal can't just send all the personal details without the consent and informing the office bearers that they're going to send it to the head of department. And the handover process is within 14 days of the election of office bearers. So now you might have a new chairperson because your chairperson last year is no longer a parent of the school, so you're going to have a new chairperson. Within 14 days of that chairperson being elected, the principal must manage the handover process. So all the documents and minutes of meetings and decisions taken, etc., that whole process must be handed over. If you've got a new secretary or treasurer, the documents and policies and stuff relevant to their portfolios must be handed over within 14 days of the election. So the principal will facilitate that. Often they get the outgoing office bearer to come in and meet with a new office bearer, present the documents, have a discussion about the role and responsibilities, etc., etc. Then, because of our pandemic, the Covert Regulations have also been written into the election process. First of all, lockdown regulations in terms of numbers and curfews must be adhered to. So if they say you may not have more than 50 members in a venue at a time, in an internal venue, or your venue may only have a 50% capacity, curfews. Remember, we had curfews, so you've got to ensure that, especially if you've got parents that are traveling at night and you're having the elections in the evening, that they will be allowed to complete the meeting and travel home and be home by the time the curfew starts. You cannot have more than 5 members in an election team. Now, election team assists the school electoral officer in terms of carrying out the duties and marking off the attendance registers and checking the IDs against the voter roll, etc., etc. In COVID, you limit it to 5. Election team members have to wear masks, visors, and gloves. So it can't just be masks and gloves. It's got to be masks, visors, and gloves. All equipment must be thoroughly disinfected. Everyone entering the voting area must be screened and have their temperature taken. Social distancing of minimum 1.5 meters must be maintained during the meeting. So when they're seated, they've got to be 1.5 meters. When they are standing in line to sign off the attendance register and check the details and present the ID, that's got to be a 1.5 meters. So every situation, there's a 1.5 meter minimum. Hand sanitizers must be available at the entrance of the voting station. Masks are compulsory. So if anyone arrives without a mask, they may not enter. I know when we were discussing it at a provincial level at the task team, they actually wanted to put it part of the KZN policy of saying that the school must make disposable masks available for those that arrive without masks. But we then raised the cost of the school for the school and all the rest. If you're using voting booths, after each person has cast a vote, it must be sanitized. So you'll have an election team member, let's say you've got 3 voting booths, you'll have an election team member stationed there, and as soon as the person's cast their vote and left that little booth, they've got to go in, they've got to sanitize it before the next person may enter and cast their vote. The voting area, they must leave after they've cast their vote, and that is why they are going to have a venue for the meeting where they explain the procedures and the nominations and introduce the candidates, and a separate venue where the actual voting takes place. And any COVID protocol not being observed, the person may not be allowed in the voting area. So if they're not there without a mask, if they refuse to have their hands sanitized, if they are not wanting to maintain the 1.5 and not comply with the COVID protocol, the school electoral officer must ensure that they leave the voting area. Now that is just the basics of the procedure. If you look at the notice that was released, there's a lot more in it because it really goes into school electoral officers and what are their duties and responsibilities and how they elected, and provincial officers and district officers, etc., and what to do for by-elections and that. Our main focus this afternoon is just saying this is how the actual procedure takes place. From the time you need to be made aware of the meeting and the election taking place to the time that the office bearers are elected and you now have a fully constituted governing body with the office bearers. I know we are slightly over time, but I will allow a couple of minutes for questions. I know Dr. DeLange is going to assist in answering because she's the technical guru on this. And I know she's answered some of your questions already in writing. There is one, I know she's answered a number of them. Are there any comments that you'd like to make, Dr. DeLange, or maybe one or two answers that you would just like to emphasize on?
Leanne, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. The one I didn't answer, I think, was directed directly at you. So there is one that I didn't answer. Can I just say good afternoon to everybody before I start with any little bits? Leanne, please feel free to stop me when the time is up.
Okay.
Can I just make one thing very clear to everybody, that the governing body is not a union. The governing body, if you look at the Act very quickly, the components, the different components on the governing body, they are elected, the members that are elected from these components. Nowhere in the Act does it say for it. So although you are from it, you cannot, teachers do that quite frequently, go back to the staff room and say, this is what has happened in the meeting. A governing body is a new unit. It is a legal persona and has its own rights. The only reason why all these people are there is to make good decisions for the school, not for the teachers or not for the children or not for non-teaching staff, but for the school. Sorry, okay, that's my sermon for that. I just want to highlight one of the things. I remember that foreigners, if their children are enrolled at the school, they have a right to be on the governing body. So just because they're a foreigner, they can't be excluded. And somebody who's not paying school fees is in a pain to everybody, has the right to be on the governing body, can't be excluded because school fees have not been paid. I want to also just add one more thing, and that is if a parent is not eligible, and if this parent would fall under any of the criteria that Leanne so nicely put out just now, then that parent has to declare that. And there's nothing stopping a school asking for clearance. It's a little bit late in the day, but there can be a request for police clearance. Those who are doing it much later can consider that. It's extremely important because we have had cases where parents have come onto the governing body and children have been abused. I can also just say every child has only got 2 parents, and we've had it several times that 3 parents arrive. And so the onus is unfortunately on the principal to ensure that these parents are on the voters' roll are actually parents. So I'm sorry that it's an extra job for principals, but that is where it goes. Okay. Last one, Leanne. Nominations that come in, we suggest that there is a register for that. The register puts a stamp on the nomination the day it arrives, and in the register record the time and the date. Now, just to make it easy, the assistant electoral officer is in charge of that. There has been a question whether the principal can see that. There's no real reason why I shouldn't, but in my book, there is a certain confidentiality that needs to be observed. And I think it would be better for the assistant electoral officer to be in charge of all of this. When the electoral officer comes around, then this is available to the electoral officer to see. Okay, thanks, Leanne. I don't know if there's anything else.
Thank you for that, Dr. De Lange. If I look at the questions, I think you've pretty much answered them. Just the one question, the voting should only be in secret. The policy states it's a secret ballot. Yep. So it has to be done in secret ballot. And Dr. De Lange, just this technical one, I'd like you to answer. If it's a case of a tie and you've got the revote, and one of the people that is involved in the tie is one that is absent. So the tie is between one who's been nominated in absentia and the other one is present. How do you do the coin toss then? Will it just be with the person that was present and they'll call heads or tails? And if they call tails and it lands on tails, then they win. If they call tails and it lands on heads, and the person in absent is the elected one.
I'm not sure what the other provinces have, but I want to recall that ours says that at the election, these people should actually be present. Although, you know, in COVID and all the rest, some of them might not be there. So if two are equal, it's actually the call of the electoral officer that the electoral officer has to make at the meeting. If he decides that it's a flip a coin, because both have equal number of votes, then the decision is his. I think what is always a good idea is for the one who doesn't make it at the first meeting of the governing body, go opt that person on. You don't get too many parents that are willing to be on a governing body.
What happens if the quorum exceeds the 100 as per Covert Regulations? I think that is a bit more of a challenging one, but Dr. De Lange, I think that as long as the school can provide a big enough venue to accommodate with the social distancing, it still can go ahead. Because if you do have a large parent component, you can't have the elections over 2 or 3 nights. It is essential that they are all in attendance. So you just need to make sure that you provide a venue large enough for the minimum quorum to maintain social distancing. So you will still have to go in. This will be the one exception of the rule in terms of the Covert Regulations. Because part of the Covert Regulations also says the capacity of the venue is a maximum of 50% of the that you can fit in. So you will look at a venue ensuring that you can accommodate the quorum with the social distancing in place, and then still having only the 50% occupation in place.
Leanne, you're perfectly right there, and it's always a good idea. Some schools have done it. Some of the ones who have completed their elections, they've asked the parents to RSVP so that they can get some sort of an idea who's going to come. But there's also nothing in any of the regulations stopping this meeting from being outside on the field. If the school has got a PA system and can do it there, not all schools can, but if they can, then the meeting can continue with more than your 50% because there's enough space. If you have it on the rugby field, there's enough space to accommodate everybody. It's not ideal, but strangely enough, so far, we've had quite a few schools who have exceeded the quorum. This year, there seems to be an amazing interest in getting onto the governing body.
Okay, thank you, Dr. De Lange. I do not see any further questions or anyone raising their hands to ask questions. So in the absence of that, I'd like to thank everyone who attended this afternoon and gave up their afternoon to be part of this session. And I think a number of you are here today because you yourselves are wanting to ensure that the processes take place fairly in your school, especially as your educators, or many of you are actually yourself are going to be or part of the nomination process or nominated to stand for the SGB election. So we thank you for being here and for availing yourselves this afternoon. And then a special thanks to Dr. De Lange, who I know she's got a very busy diary and is always willing to assist us. I'm often on the phone with her and she's always more than willing to answer our questions. So Dr. De Lange, a special thanks to you for making space in your diary to be here this afternoon to give your expertise. And we really appreciate it. And to those of you who attended, if there are any further questions you have, feel free to contact your union office and they will be able to provide you with further assistance. Have a good afternoon. Enjoy